So hope you enjoyed the lunch and the concurrent workshops. We have an excellent panel. After lunch is a hard slot, and so we put the best here. I just want to say how excited I am. Those of us who were in Nashville at the last GSER convening, we had a fantastic panel or discussion with Kung Lee kicking it off, and then a discussion between Michelle Alexander and Darren Walker around the role of race and mass incarceration and the new Jim Crow in the context of immigration. And I was really excited to see the feedback, because that was kind of a foray into a new area for us at the convening. We got overwhelmingly positive feedback from all of you. People really ranked it as one of the best plenaries, that they took a lot away, that they were going to apply it to their grant making. So we were thrilled. It's obviously timely and substantively on point to present today's panel. I'm going to introduce Dimple in a second, but I'll just say, obviously, I feel it's redundant and goes without saying that race and social movements and what we're discussing has everything to do with immigration and what you all are funding. And I don't know if anybody else was looking at the New York Times on the flight here yesterday. On the front page, front and center, was a story of these climate refugees, as they were named, the island off of Louisiana that's sinking due to environmental degradation, and how the government is going to put many millions of dollars into resettling this group. And I was thinking, this is great. This is going to help people really internalize the idea that migration is intrinsic. It's in all of us. We move. This will feel like a more worthy set of refugees because it's the environment that's making them move, and maybe people will be more sympathetic. But I don't know how many of you are in the same boat as me. I quickly looked to see what race those refugees were, because we cannot get away from the fact that were those black faces moving from that island there and the government was resettling, the internal discourse for people and in our public would have been different. And that is something that I think as philanthropy we've not grappled with enough. There's no easy answer, but it's something that we need to keep deepening our learning and thinking. We have the best panel ever to help us unpack that. Dimple, for those of you who don't know, Dimple Abichandani joined the General Service Foundation as executive director just last year. But we all know her well. She's worked for the past 2 decades as a funder, advocate, and educator. She was the founding program officer for the Security and Rights Collaborative at the Proteus Fund. Some of us know her from that context. And we asked Dimple to moderate this panel because she has such deep knowledge and expertise and is such a thoughtful thinker on these issues. So please join me in welcoming Dimple, and she'll introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Myra. Thank you. So, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited for this conversation. We couldn't have a better panel. And I wanted to just share kind of 2 very quick stories to, I guess, just share a little bit about why I'm excited to be in conversation with both of you. So I'm from Texas. I grew up in Houston, and I actually went to college here at UT Austin. I haven't lived here since 1995, but I come back pretty frequently to visit my family. This past December, about 2 weeks after Trump talked about banning Muslims, I was visiting my mom, who lives about 2 hours away from here. And we were sort of settling in for an evening conversation, and she said, she's part of a large spiritual community of fellow meditators. So we were settling in, and she said, I want to ask you about something. And she shared that in her spiritual community, that the elders in the community had been talking about how if Trump becomes president, then people might have to leave the country. And she said that, at first she kind of ignored the comments, but then they started to kind of move beyond the elders, and she started to hear more and more people talking about this. And so, she sort of brought it up to me, and she said, that can't be right? She was like, I've lived here for 42 years, I'm a citizen, tell me that can't be the case. And from a place of being her daughter and not understanding that she had been carrying this anxiety, I wanted nothing more than to say, that is insane. That can't be right. But I was so startled by, to use this phrase that Janet talked about at the plenary that we had this morning, the effect of Trumpism, right? And so the conversation that we ended up having was one that touched on the Japanese internment, which my mom didn't know about, which I think many immigrants don't know about. We talked about all the ways in which national security policy is intertwined with immigration policy. And as we were talking, what I was so aware of was that while this type of conversation may have been happening and probably is happening even more today in immigrant households around the country, I was so aware of the fact that not all immigrants were talking about these issues, right? So I was thinking Canadian immigrants to the US are not talking about whether they might have to go somewhere else after being here for over 40 years, or European immigrants. And so we talked about all of the ways in which race was also a factor. So I just wanted to sort of share that, we're in this moment of where belonging, I think, is a cross-cutting issue, right? So the other story that I wanted to just share to set us up, it's a GSER story. So around the same time in December, GSER and the Security Rights Collaborative and For Freedom's Fund pulled together a small group of funders to strategize about this moment of so much hate, right? And for me, sitting in that room, it was both exciting to see that there were racial justice funders talking to immigrant rights funders, talking to funders that are coming at issues of Islamophobia. So seeing that kind of conversation happen across those issues was exciting. And I was so aware of the fact that, in my role at the General Service Foundation, we are a social justice funder. And I was so aware of the fact that there was still a broader set of funders that are not having this conversation, right? And so where we come from is understanding that whenever there's any one group that's being excluded, that it actually impacts our ability to work on any of these issues. And so this question of for me, this question that I've been sitting with and that I'm so excited to engage with our panelists about is sort of what will it take for philanthropy to just have like a bigger set of people around these tables, and for us to come up with answers to those bigger questions. So those are the two kind of stories that bring me here. And as Myra said, we couldn't have a more amazing panel. Sadly, we had a last-minute cancellation. So Opal Tometi from Black Lives Matter and from the Black Alliance for Just Immigration unfortunately got sick at the last moment and really regrets not being able to join us. She's asked that we share a video of her work just to bring her into the room. And so I'm going to quickly introduce our two panelists who are here, and then we're going to start with the video, and then we'll launch into the discussion. Okay? So I think just judging by all the fans that were coming up here, I think you know our panelists, but I'm going to introduce them anyway. And I'm going to ask the crowds to stand back. So Linda Sarsour, known as every Islamophobe's worst nightmare, executive director of Arab American Association of New York, wears many other hats. All of their bios are in your material, so I won't read their bios. But it's just been an incredible voice, organizing for a decade and a half at least, really modeling what it looks like to work across issues. So happy that you're here. And Marisa Franco, who directs the Not One More campaign, also founder of Mijente, also another amazing activist who models what it's like to work across movements. Also author of a brilliant two-piece article, How Social Change is Changing. Did I get that right? How there's change in social change. It's amazing. I shared her article last fall with my board, and if you haven't read it, highly recommend that you take a look at it. So with that, I'm going to turn us to the video, and then we're going to launch right into our conversation.
face many different prejudices in the different places that we come from.
I've been traveling here for a number of years, but one of my main reasons being a gay man, that was really, really for me to move here. To Jamaica is one of the most homophobic countries in the world, and the problems that we have here is just mind-boggling, and it's so dangerous. I feared my life, and I didn't know at what point, what if anything serious was going to happen to me. I wasn't going to stick around and wait.
This space allows those people a sense of kinship and assembly where they don't need to hide who they are. They don't need to be ashamed or hold back. They can speak freely and proudly, and knowing that everyone in the room is 100% behind them and waiting for them to express their truest and most honest self.
So I'm excited about Vaji and the work that we do with our members in the Black Immigration Network. I see our organization and our communities only becoming more and more powerful as the years go on. In 5 years, and 10 years, and 20 years, we're going to see our entire world change. And it's because we're going to see people rising up, taking and stepping into their full dignity, and making sure that we hold those that have power accountable, and that we set the terms for our own liberation.
Okay, so that makes me even more sad that Opal's not with us, but it was nice to bring them into the room. I'm going to ask Linda, Marisa, will you guys just start us off by describing the work you do, and describe it as if you were talking to someone in your community and not a funder. How do you do that? We're all not here. You want to start, Marisa?
When you asked me that question, I thought, what do I say when my family asks me, where are you and why are you not coming around? And so then I'm from Phoenix, Arizona. So the easiest way, the only thing I can think of that I can thank Sheriff Joe Arpaio for is, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, SB 1070, we're trying to fight to defeat that. So that's probably the most simple way to describe it.
Nice.
I don't know if there are some words, you said the funders are not here, was that how you set it up?
So when you're not talking to funders, is your mic on?
Is my mic on? Is my mic on?
Yeah.
I'm usually a loud New Yorker.
Yeah. So when you're not talking to funders and you're just describing what you do.
I think for me and in my community, it's about being your full self, understanding that we too are American, and that we are not asking or asking anybody for any favors, but we are demanding the very rights that we all deserve. So my work is around building the self-worth and dignity of our community so that we are not always at the bottom, but understanding that we deserve to be at the top with everybody else in this country.
Nice. So we want to get a little bit of feedback from all of you. So if you could take out your cell phones, we're going to do a quick poll everywhere. So there's a couple of steps to this. So we're using the same number that we used this morning. And to get it started, we have to text the word leave and then text GSER. Is that, Felicia, is that right? Yes. So text leave and then text GSER. And then the first question we have for you is about your foundation. Oh, you guys are on it. This is great. Okay. So can you see this?
What was the question?
So the question is about how your foundation's giving is organized. So my foundation has a portfolio on race, a portfolio on immigration, a portfolio that combines race and immigration, and none of the above. All right, interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. This is a follow-up. So at my foundation, making a grant that spans more than one program area is, so we have generally not permitted or hard to do, possible but requires some effort and negotiation, permitted, encouraged or expected, or I'm not sure. Okay, this is really interesting. Let's give ourselves one more minute. Are people still responding? Yeah. Wow, that's great. So mostly encouraged or expected. Okay, so we're going to weave this into our conversation as we keep going.
Take notes, Marisa.
I'm doing it.
Yeah.
I got a big book. I can take notes for the both of us.
Encouraged.
Okay, so I want us to start by talking a little bit about this moment that we're in. And so here's a reflection for you guys to respond to. So, I remember after 9/11, kind of in those early years after 9/11, I remember being really shocked at how it seemed like the kind of post-9/11 framework, so the move to a national security framework, the surveillance, the profiling of Muslim Americans, the Patriot Act. Sort of my early analysis of that was that because of fear, we had moved away from deeply held values. And then years later, when I started working with the Security and Rights Collaborative, I started to question how deeply held were those views. So sort of like my own evolution was going from thinking that we've moved away from our deeply held values to wondering whether did we really deeply hold those values, right? So was there a fragility that needed to shape our work? And so in the context of immigration, we talk about, even here this morning, we talk about how we are a nation of immigrants. Yet in this election cycle, we've really seen how communities of color and immigrants have been such easy targets. So in your work, how do you think about the sort of what we need to build so that we are not here again?
I think for me, I always felt that we were in a place of fragility, and that even since the founding of our nation, we've been far away from any values that were supposedly the founding values of our nation that we never really kind of grasped onto and really emulated and actually made reality. So that I've always been under that assumption all the time. And what really bothers me about this moment right now is that it seems like there's a revelation that everybody has. Everybody seems to be like, oh, this is outrageous. Registering Muslims? We would never let that happen in our country. Patrolling Muslim neighborhoods? What do they mean? Where are the Muslim neighborhoods? How outrageous. And it takes me back to 2003 when the US government created a registration program for Muslim males over the age of 16. About 180,000 immigrant men in this country complied with that program, and over 10% were put on deportation proceedings. So when Donald Trump says register Muslims, I'm actually offended sometimes, just in the general sphere of how offensive people found, even within some of the movement work that we do. I'm like, where have you been? On issues of patrolling communities, let's talk about New York City. Under unwarranted surveillance outed by the Associated Press and investigative reports, monitoring 250 mosques, labeling leadership in our community as the most dangerous, as radical, right? So this is things that are already happening, right? And people say, oh, Muslims, we can't ban the Muslims. That would never happen in the United States of America. We wouldn't let that happen. Chinese Exclusion Act, anybody? When someone invokes internment camps, I want to know who lived in this country at the time of Japanese internment camps. Who was that silent majority that lived here that allowed that to happen to our Japanese American sisters and brothers? So what I'm trying to convey is that I don't know if we ever had those values or if we ever held them. And I think that we are in a moment right now that's a make it or break it moment for all of us, for everybody that lives in this country. And I want people to understand that a lot of the work that we've been doing over the course of the past 15 years, particularly around immigration, let's look at the reality. Every single day, 1,000 people are being deported, right? That's facts. Let's add that up over the course of the past 8 years, right? So I feel like I'm doing this work based on this idea that I want to live and survive, and I want my community to survive, right? I'm actually not a pragmatic organizer at all. I want it all. And I think that if we don't fight for it all, we're going to get nothing. And we've gotten nothing in the immigrant rights movement because we keep wanting to be pragmatic. And I think in the moment that I'm in right now, I think that our communities deserve to dream. Our communities deserve to visualize what an ideal America looks like, what an America is that we want to live in, that our children and great-grandchildren. I'm tired of telling my kids, you're lucky that you live here. You're lucky that you don't live in Syria. You're lucky that we don't live in Pakistan. Like, that's not the kind of story that I want to tell my kids. I tell my kids, you live in the United States of America, you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect like everybody else. And I don't think that anybody in this room, outside of this room, in our movement should be settling for less. And this is the premise that we're working on in the movements that are considered to be fringe movements, considered non-pragmatic, leaderless movements. These are the things that we're hearing. You know what? Those are the movements that are getting things done, and that's the movements that I want to be a part of.
Thank you for front and center taking on this doctrine of a nation of immigrants and the foundations of this country. So I won't go into that. I feel like you hit it, but thank you.
Take it on again, only take it home.
No, because I think it erases the legacy of this country and what it was built on. How did we get the land and how did we get the labor, and who was that? And so I think it's so thank you. I mean, for us, so with Mijente and Not One More is several years in the making, and Mijente, we just birthed it last year. And so it kind of felt like for us, we were building a little house. We got the plywood and we launched, and then we're like trying to figure out where we want to put the couch and where do you put this painting or that painting, and all of a sudden there's a zombie apocalypse outside politically with this election. And I think like many different groups and communities and organizers, you have to ask that question. I had this plan and this is happening. What do I do, right? I think it's important to note that when we think about what's happening in this country, when we, I've just been on this thing recently of this red state, blue state thing. When we talk about what's happening, when we see what's happening in North Carolina with HB2, when we look back in 2010 at SB 1070, those laws are not anomalies. Mm-hmm. They are pre-shocks. They are a foreshadowing of a version of a future. Mm-hmm. It is not just the blue states that are, we're gonna go purple, then we're gonna go blue. I'm telling you, coming from where I'm coming from and many of the places and communities that I organize with, that is not the reality. What we're undergoing is a significant backlash. So this election is unveiling for all of us to see the prolonged economic stagnation and austerity that in many communities of color, it's been there. Mm-hmm. But it's starting to spill over into other communities, and it's now starting to get to a crisis point. You have real fear and anxiety about the changing nature of this country, and that's both in terms of who lives here, but also people's lifestyles, people's way of living, people's beliefs, and people seeing all of this different social movement. Target, put out this position around the bathroom policy, and there was 1 million signatures, angry that Target was having this policy that was trans-inclusive for their bathrooms. And so these are the things that we're facing, and I think that if we understand this as backlash and not just anomalies, not just these little pockets of places we can ignore except for during an election year, then we're much more situated in reality. And if we're dealing with reality, then we can impact it and change it, at least reckon with it, right? And so for us, I think we've been willing to go in the places that feel hard, to say the things that are unpopular, and to stand with the people that are the most easily discarded. And what we've found is that this idea, like Linda was speaking to, that like we're always told, you gotta go find the middle. Who's in the middle? Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, or go for the lowest hanging fruit. And like I've always said, like, no, I don't want to go after the low hanging fruit. I want to shake the whole damn tree. And I think that there's this aspect, like one of the reasons I think that the Not One More campaign was so successful in some of the interventions that it made was that it spoke to where people's pain was, and it went to the bleeding point. So everyone would agree, yes, we want legislation at the federal level. Yes, we want all these good things. But my partner's being deported. I don't know how is my child going to be able to get an education if they're undocumented. I'm at work and I'm asking, I'm trying to organize and I'm being threatened that they're going to call ICE on me. And so I think that I think it's a very important moment to be thinking about where we situate ourselves. And I would argue we need to center ourselves on the margins, because that's where we find new sources of power. The other thing I think for us in the Not One More campaign, as a campaign that is rooted in immigrant communities and in the immigrant rights movement, we also then last year pivoted to say, okay, we actually want to explore this idea of building across the Latino community, or Latinx, which is the new gender neutral term, and build between immigrant and non-immigrant people. And actually, let's make some room inside of the immigrant rights movement, because some of the critiques that were named in the video, they're real. There's this way where there's been a conflation between Latino and immigrant, and it's been problematic, I think, on both sides. And I think there's potential power in actually filling a gap that's been a big gap inside of the Latino community that's not necessarily immigrant.
Thank you for that. Here. There's so much. Do you want to say what some of those things are that are hard? So you talked about being willing to say some of the things that are hard in the movement.
Ooh, where do we start?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just good.
Yeah.
It's good to be explicit, right? So when you talk about centering yourselves on the margins.
Yeah. I mean,
Practically.
let's have a conversation about the moment now, for example. So we're talking about cross-sector, but I think to be able to be helpful across sectors, we need to be actually whole inside of a sector as well. So with DAPA and DACA Plus, I think we won on policy, we've lost on process. What does that mean? It means that we're in a situation now where it's stalled, but the bulk of, when you think of institutional power, resources, and focus, it's still on, is that going to pass, or is it going to pass the courts, and how are we going to implement it? 4 to 5 million people eligible, and just as many, if not more, are left out. And so what's hard? What's hard is, what about those people that are left out? What about the fact that it's actually, deportations are going down? That makes it really hard. But the money is going up. Do we think they're holding bake sales with that money over at DHS and ICE? No. They're finding new ways to detain, to identify, to hunt down, to deport and incarcerate our people. And so what's hard to say is that one thing I would say, we were one of the groups that argued and pushed for executive action, for Beyond Dreamers, right? That was one of the main demands of the Not One More campaign. President Obama stopped deportations. And a hard thing about that is that it was successful, but so many people are left out. And are we in a better place now? Are we in a place where, say the Supreme Court, it goes through and it actually passes, 5 years from now, are we going to be even in a deeper hole for the people that are not deserving? Other hard things to say is, how are we going to ensure that we're not throwing each other under the bus? How can we even have solidarity with other communities and other sectors if we can't have that level of solidarity inside of our own community and inside of our own sector?
So one more follow-up. I'm going to ask your thoughts on this, Linda. So you said before we can be helpful across issues or across sectors, we need to be whole in ourselves. And I saw you sort of nodding. What does that mean to you? What does it look like to be whole in yourself?
I think that me as an individual and the way that I organize, I feel whole. You know, I'm a woman, I'm a child of immigrants, I'm Muslim, I'm a woman of color, I'm from a, urban city. I see myself as a whole person. But I don't know if the movements see myself and people who are like me from my community as a whole person. I don't know if philanthropy looks at me and sees me as a whole person, as a whole community with a lot of complexities and a lot of issues that we work on. And I think this idea of being seen as a community that is only from the perspective of national security is really problematic and has hindered our ability to build power and to build the capacity of our community. And I'll give you a straight example because we're going to keep it real here. Like Hillary Clinton the other day when she won in New York, this is how she referred to our community, thinking this was a compliment. She said the terror-hating Muslims. That's not how I want to be known. That's not the frame that I want to be in. I don't want people to refer to my community in the context of only when it comes to terrorism or countering terrorism. I'm a community that cares about healthcare and education and jobs and economic opportunities. I'm a community that cares about women's issues and reproductive rights. I'm a community that comes with people who are whole and have so much complexities and so much needs, but for some reason, people want to look at me and say, I see this. Countering terrorism, countering violent extremism programs. Let's talk about post 9/11. My community has been here way before 9/11 ever started, and we're going to be here way after 9/11 ever started. So these things are really challenging for people to be seen. I mean, even our young people. I mean, the way that our education system said, like the minute somebody brings up a situation or brings up Donald Trump, like my daughter's 12 years old, she says, Mom, everybody looks at me in my class. And it's like, that's the situation, like our kids are in this situation where the psychological trauma that our community is being put through, Latinos, when a young Mexican kid hears that Mexicans are all rapists, like people just brush that off like, oh, some crazy white guys on national television saying that, not understanding the impact that this has, that this is breaking down the wholesomeness of our community, right? Having to prove our worth as a community. No, we are not that. We are not that. I want to start saying what I am. And I found myself for the past 15 years oftentimes framing our community from the perspective of what we are not versus what we are. People think it's easy. It's not. We're always on the defensive. And it's time for us to be proactive, right? It's time for us to, both as movements and as philanthropy, and I'm going to put this out there, and this is a 501c3 conference, but I think I just got to put this out there because I think this is important. You know, watching the presidential elections and being someone that has been in my individual capacity, part of the Bernie Sanders campaign, one of the things that I want to say that I've learned from that experience is that here I am in cities across the country, climate justice, women's rights, immigrants and immigrant rights, Black Lives Matter activists, Arab American, South Asian, and Muslims all in one place together and building power together. And I thought to myself, what if we, from the social justice movement perspective, not electoral organizing, started doing that and understanding the landscape of building power requires us to work not only across community and across geography, but also across movement. And it was so seamless. There was no one in there being like, climate justice is more important, immigrants, got to talk about the immigrant. The climate justice people were like, what do we got to do? We got to bring in the Muslims. The immigrants were like, wait, there aren't any Black immigrants here. So this was an opportunity for me to actually engage in the past year in understanding about what it is to actually build power. And back to this idea of centering us on the margins. Let's keep it real. People don't want to give money to what they consider to be risky organizing. Let's be real about that, right? People don't want to give money to the young people that are chaining themselves in the middle of a highway, right? we always, I don't know. I don't know if our donors are going to like that, you know. I don't know if our donors are going to like us giving to the groups that are also talking about how black liberation is connected to Palestinian liberation. Oh no, I don't know. But guess what? Those who are at the margins, those who are doing the riskiest organizing in our community are getting things done, and they are winning big. Let's use Chicago as an example. Those young people in Chicago, they shutting down Trump every time Trump dare shows up there. They are working against the police department, getting the damn police commissioner to resign. And then when it came to electoral organizing, they took out Anita Alvarez, right? Who was the DA who covered up on the Kwame Don. Like, let's look at who did that. It wasn't the typical mainstream organizers or the, you know, safe organizations. It was the people at the margins most directly impacted by the very issues that they were fighting about. Those are not the people we're giving the money to. So I think for me, centering on the margins is getting to a point where we say once and for all, we got to go big or go home. And I think that movements are already doing that. So we either get on that ship, right, and be there to celebrate with those who win later on, or we're off the ship and we watch that ship pass by and say, damn, I wish I would have gotten on it. Because that's exactly where the movement is going, and that's exactly where this next generation is going, and that's where the organizing is going. We're in a moment right now where we're doing the work regardless, without any resources, and I think that we're getting to a point where our communities are on the line. The stakes are high. Like, we got no choice. Like, I don't have a choice not to do this and be like, oh man, the funder didn't come through, so I guess can't do that work. Got to go to another funder and make up a new program. No, I got to do it. Marisa got to do it. We got to do this work. So I think that's this idea of centering on the margins, I think, is a theme that we really need to like grasp and absorb.
So your story about, in the Bernie context, right, essentially this cross-issue movement that's starting to build. Tell me more about what makes that work. What's making that possible?
We live in a country where historically this has always happened. And this is also a more international context, but I'm going to keep it domestic. It's all about divide and conquer. It's all about the powers that be who are trying to divide us and don't want to see us working together. Their worst nightmare is to see black people organizing with Latinos, organizing with Muslims, organizing with Asian Americans. God forbid that anybody sees that happening. Their worst nightmare is also movements, right? Because they want to give a little something to the climate justice people, right? They'll drop you an executive order for the immigrant rights folks, right? Just don't bring up none of that mass incarceration business. Please don't bring up the Muslims and all that national security stuff. We can't share any information. That's just, trust me, it's not going to help you move further. Just listen to me. I've been in these places, right? And I'll give you a very clear example. When we were around the Senate legislation around immigration, black immigrants thrown under the bus. We're going to get rid of diversity visas. Do you know what countries benefit from diversity visas? African countries, North African countries. We were going to throw them under the bus because we wanted to settle on a piece of legislation. So here's a whole community, literally. If you ask African immigrants in particular, including Arab immigrants who are from North Africa, how did you get here? Green card lottery. So we were literally about to get rid of that, right? Because we wanted to settle. Then in the legislation, they were going to codify extremely problematic racial profiling language that throws Latinos on the borders under the bus and throws Muslims under the bus. Linda will deal with that later. This is not hearsay. I was part of these conversations. I'm in conversations where people in the movement, particularly larger organizations, were throwing us under the bus, throwing me under the bus while I was right there. And I think that, for me, has moved a lot of us out of this mainstream organizing and took us to the margins, right? Because we're like, not only are we being sold out by the powers that be, but those in our community, as they get more access to power, they become part of that dynamic. And they actually hurt us more than they think they are. And I'm not saying it's bad intentioned. Like, I want to be clear here. I don't think those people are in there being like, we're about to put our communities, I think they really genuinely believe that we have to negotiate everything. I'm tired of negotiating. We haven't gotten anything in 15 years with this negotiation process that is throwing black immigrants under the bus, throwing Muslims under the bus, border issues, these loopholes. So what I think we got to a point where when I watched the organizing I've done in a place like New York City on police reform, look, we did police reform, landmark police reform legislation under a notorious regime run by Mayor Michael Bloomberg. Billions of dollars. He's basically, okay, he's a little better than Donald Trump, but he kind of fits in that category. Self-funded, pretty much is set in his position. I get it, he's good on immigration, I get that. But he's not good on other stuff. So on police reform, black groups, police reform groups, folks doing ending mass incarceration, immigrant rights groups, LGBT groups, Muslim groups, we all got together. And we said, here's the end surveillance folks, which were us. Here are the end stop and frisk folks, right? We're gonna do this together. And guess what? We went up against Michael Bloomberg, he vetoed us. We went back to our communities and we built power together. Guess what happened? We went back again and we won bigger than we won the first time with the obstacle of Michael Bloomberg funding city council candidates against our candidates who voted with our legislation. We didn't have super PACs, we didn't have lobbying groups on our behalf. We had nobody but our communities and the power that we were building in this idea of building a coalition around the Community Safety Act. So we know that it works. We know that building power amongst communities of color works. So the question is, do we in this room believe that? Yeah. Do we believe in the power of the people and the will of the people when we invest in the most directly impacted? Do we believe that when we fund Arab, Muslim, South Asian, Latino, Black groups, Asian American groups, and other groups that do civil rights group together, right? So that funding is collaborative because the work is being collaborative, right? So my perspective is this. The funding has to match the work. If the work is collaborative, if it's based on coalition work, then that's how the funding has to be. Because if it's not the same, then it's not working. Yeah. So I think that we have many examples across the country of groups working together across movements, across issues, and really using a racial justice analysis that has really brought in more people than ever before in a conversation around immigration, immigrant rights, incarceration, and detention.
So you've kind of given us a nice segue to talking about philanthropy's role, right? And both of you, I think, have been referencing and talking about how movements are changing, right? How the dynamics are shifting, the models are new. So I wonder, in your experience, are you seeing ways that philanthropy is able to meet these new models? Are you seeing ways that philanthropy has been helpful, or are you experiencing barriers? And maybe I'll start with Marisa.
Well, I think first it's important to just break down what's happening. Think Hyundai, not Cadillac. Think microbrewery, not Walmart. People want to connect, and people want to create. Fundamentally, they want to belong. And so the old ways, the ways that we're accustomed to of organizing people under banners and into organizations and into memberships is falling short. I think you can see that in labor. I think you can see it in traditional sort of large-scale organizations. And then you see, the proliferation in the movement for Black lives. Why? Why are people joining? Why are they not joining other things? And so I think there's a real need to look under the hood in terms of what's working. And so we wrote this article that was that was called "How We Make Changes Changing." How we communicate, how we coordinate, all of these things are changing. And so to me, it's been much more think about platform and not institution. Mm-hmm. And for me as an organizer, it's actually it keeps me in check because it's inevitable that the more I build institution, the more my job is to just protect that institution. Mm-hmm. And so I want to build the leanest possible institution and actually, deal with the scarcity and embrace the scarcity as long as we're purposeful. Because as long as we're doing something that is both needed, possible, and bold, we resource our own movements. Because people will join, people move, people create, people shape, and people resource. And I think those are some, it's really important to understand those changes. And I think we all know it. I think sometimes we don't know exactly how to fix it. But we've been approaching it much more from that perspective of like, how do we find things that really matter to people, create a lot of entry points, keep the infrastructure lean, keep it as needed. And so it's platforms, and almost like when you do need to know, it's on a need to know basis. It's almost like institution on a need to exist basis. And so obviously this presents challenges for philanthropy. I'm a big nerd in entrepreneurship and tech and startups, and so it's like, oh, this is investment. Obviously the outcome isn't profits, but it's social impact. But the relationship is the same. The relationship is what is the investment, or what am I betting on here, right? And I think that on our side, for me, it makes me break out in hives when I have to predict what will happen. Because as an organizer, that's very much like, it's about relationships, and that's very, fluid work. And it's about politics, it's about assessment that we can't always predict. Or else, for us, we're setting up the house, and we had all these plans, and we're gonna have a housewarming party, and then the political zombie apocalypse happens. And I wanna be the type of organizer, we need to be the type of movement, we need the type of organizations that says, you know what, we'll throw the housewarming later, we need to go out and figure out what we're gonna do about this. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes, there's a tendency, or there's a relationship where you feel like you can't do that, you feel like you have to predict at all costs, and that you can't experiment. And so there's real contradictions and tensions there. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there are places where we're seeing, that type of innovation, and I think that there's adjustments on both sides, mm-hmm. both in terms of social change organizations and movements, and on the part of philanthropic organizations that want to help fund them. I think that there's shift needed on both sides.
Marisa, that was amazing, and I just want to lift out a couple of things you said, because you've said so much. So I, in terms of thinking about why this is challenging for institutional philanthropy, I think this point about how it's not about institutions, but it's about platforms, is so key, because a lot of our institutions have been created to fund institutions, right? And when we were talking earlier about sort of the mainstream establishment that's more well-resourced, it's not just people, those are like well-resourced institutions, mm-hmm. that for decades have been funded and that have, sort of long-standing relationships with philanthropy, right? So I think this point is really important. And then what I'm hearing you say is that there needs to be some flexibility, right, in the relationships between leaders and philanthropy, so that we can pivot when needed, so that we can be resilient in the face of all of these attacks, and so that it's not on your shoulders to guarantee certain outcomes in what is a rapidly changing environment. Mm-hmm. I think it's really helpful. So both of you have kind of touched on, and Linda, you really kind of went into this, the idea of work at the margins as being seen as risky, but also as the place where we're seeing lots of impact. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask both of you to just share kind of, how do you think about risk? Like, what are some risks that you are taking in your work? And then I'm going to ask you all some questions about risks here as well.
Well, before we get into it, I think that, not to complicate it, but it's actually like, it seems risky, but it's like folks who are on the margin, but it's not that they're in the minority, oftentimes. Mm-hmm. It's that they've been pushed there. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Black women. You can't, actually, we're having a conversation about race and immigration. Yeah. Right now, we can't talk about race without talking about gender. Mm-hmm. And we, because looking at the epicenter that's like a beating heart in social movement right now, it's the movement for Black lives. Yeah. And who is driving that? It is Black women. And we're in an election season, and Black women almost single-handedly deliver presidencies over and over again to the Democratic Party. They're not on the margin. They're actually steady, like voting, steady participating, but they've been moved over here. And so I don't want margin to mean little. I don't want you to think little. I don't want you to think minority. I think marginalized, think moved out of the way. And so it's actually bringing people into a more righteous and true position of where they actually stand. So in terms of so you're saying in terms of risk, what is the risk?
So not what is the risk, but are there places, as you think about your work, are there places that you are consciously taking a risk? And do you feel, and let me add another question to that, do you feel like that's supported by philanthropy?
I'll tell you what. I was driving from Creating Change with my partner last year, leaving Denver. It was last year. It's a really long drive. You think it's really close. The West is just deceiving. You think, oh, it'll be, no, it's like 20 hours. And, we were just debriefing, and I just couldn't get Jesse Hernandez out of my head.
Some people don't know what Creating Change is.
People don't know what Creating Change is. It's the largest LGBTQ progressive conference that happens every year. And it happened in Denver a couple years ago, and I couldn't get Jesse Hernandez out of my head. Hi, Heidi, by the way. Thanks for that. I couldn't get her out of my head. So in case you don't know who Jesse Hernandez is, she was a young girl, I think like about 15 years old, that was shot by Denver PD. She had allegedly stole a car and was driving, joyriding with her friends. And they said that she was trying to, leave, and people said she had stopped, and they shot up the car, and she was killed. Jesse was, and I was in a moment of discernment. President Obama had announced the executive order in November of the year before, and we were trying to figure out what to do. And there were so many wonderful things that we had learned, and so much momentum, and so many people felt deep connection to the Not One More campaign. And but I couldn't shake the feeling. I'm Chicana, my parents are from Mexico, I'm from the Southwest, so it's a little bit of an affinity I felt. This young girl was killed. She was killed by police. She was queer, gender nonconforming. She was Latina, but not immigrant, probably the children of immigrant. And I thought, everybody might have that child's name in their mouth right now, but what movement is going to claim her? And the answer, there was none, and I knew it. And it made me feel sick. It made me feel like that was me. And I just felt we need to build a justice movement that will seek justice, that will seek something for her. And so it was a very tricky move. It was a risk to go from the immigrant rights movement and being Latina and Chicana in the immigrant rights movement, which is tricky sometimes, and having these conversations with, undocumented parents who are like, what do you mean? Why are we going to move over there? Like, I'm cool here, And I was like, is it possible for you, Rosy, this person I'm thinking of is Rosy, is it possible? I think it's unacceptable for the only place for you to be able to advocate. You're one of the best, baddest organizers I know. So why should you only be able to advocate because of your immigration status? You also have healthcare needs, you have education needs, you have labor needs. And why should Latinos who are born in the US get many don't have a place, but those that do, why do they get to have a political movement or moment or place without having to contend with you? Could we be more powerful? Could we be more effective? Risky? Yes. Because Latino is an umbrella of so many different groups. There's so much different drama. There's drama between nationalities. There's drama between immigrant versus non-immigrant. There is, and there's a legacy, I think, of colonization that teaches us to move very far away from Blackness and very far away from Indigenous. And so, but it felt to me like there was a risk of leading people in the wrong direction. There was a risk of failure. There was a risk of just being scared of trying something different that I wasn't, and it was kind of coming from me. But the idea that the possibility and the need for Latinos, who are one of the largest, fastest growing populations in this country, to one, not stand on the right side of history was unbearable to me, and two, for us to actually buck this idea of advancement of Latinos in the way we understand it. I had a chance to see some of the conversation earlier between Danielle and Janet, and I feel like, you know, we have to ask a question. When we talk about the advancement of Latinos in the United States, how many of us are included, and who are we stepping on the way there? And if we don't build a movement of Latinos and engage Latinos in these conscious, critical questions and address people's real issues, that demographic change will be a promise unfulfilled, because it is not guaranteed. And so it's tremendously risky, but it felt like an even greater risk to not do that.
Thank you. So we're just going to ask you all, take your phones out again. We're going to ask you a few questions about risk, and then we're going to open it up.
Are we still in Leave G-Sir?
I think we should be able to just answer these now. Yep. So we've asked our speakers about risks that they're taking. We want to hear about your how you think about risk as a funder. So this first question is about how you describe your foundation when it comes to taking risks. Great, we'll give this one more minute. Okay, most of us are somewhat willing to take risks. We've got a growing number of people in extremely risk tolerant. Okay, this is fascinating. So one more question then. We're going to go to the next poll. And here we wanted to just get a sense of what allows you to take more risks in your grant making. So we've got a couple of options up here. So meeting with local groups and leaders that are not on your radar screen, getting support so you can make the case within your foundation, connecting with highly risk-tolerant funders so that you can learn from their approach. And the last one is not sure, that it's hard to shift your current grant-making approach. Okay, I think this is really helpful feedback for GSIR here. So we'll take one more minute. Great. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left until we wrap up. So I feel like we could keep talking for a long time, but I do want to bring you all into the conversation. I think we have people with mics. So if people could start just raising your hands if you have questions for our speakers. And we'll start back here.
Yeah, Marisa, if you could just be more explicit about what you mean by platform rather than institution. I don't think everybody I think we have different ideas of what platform means. Do you want to take a few? Or?
Yeah, let's go ahead and take 2 or 3 questions and then we can start. Are there other questions? Really? Yeah.
Dimple, I'm behind the podium.
Oh, okay.
Sneaking up on you.
Hello, Mayra.
Hi, this is a very straightforward question for Marisa. Could you describe, hi, we fund the Not One More campaign and some of the allies, but it would be great if you could describe for us the campaign. You've described some of what you thought made it successful, but not everybody's familiar with the work, so that would be helpful. Thanks.
Cool. Fantastic. Okay, and we can take one more question. If there's one in the room. Shireen.
So I think both of you talked about this kind of feeling of sort of constant firefighting and not having the ability to sort of build capacity for the long term and to actually think maybe even proactively about what you want to be and not just what you're against. So I would love to hear your thoughts about what's needed to build that long-term strength and what kind of resources or capacity you need.
Great. Okay, Marisa, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So the focus of the Not One More campaign, so what we call it an open source campaign. I think other folks have called it networked organizing or distributed organizing, and then perhaps momentum driven organizing. And so the goal of the campaign was to intervene on the deportation crisis, the detention crisis inside of the immigrant communities. And the way that it works is that we work very closely with a pretty, limited number of groups, but it flows. So we don't have a steering committee per se. We tend to call the groups that we work closest with a team of the willing. And that's built over time. So I think that's one thing that's important. We felt that just defaulting to the coalitional structures with everything was based on just, I have a seat at the table regardless, without trust, without commitment, without political alignment, meant that we would be spending most of our time structuring structure and processing process. And so there was very much a multi-tiered system of how groups functioned. So local groups make calls on their own campaigns. The national team is moving, but parameters are very important. Parameters and purpose is very important. And so the way that it worked is so that you had essentially a banner demand. So for us, that was Not One More. It's pretty unequivocal, right? But underneath that, then there was federal level demands or national demands that groups then were tying their local campaign work to. So some groups, work on local legislation to try to limit collaboration between police and ICE. Some groups, even small, like not necessarily just C3 organizations, but collectives of people fight individual deportations, and that has been really the thoroughfare to where the campaign has really grown to be very intersectional. And then other groups are working on detention issues, trying to close detention centers, whether they be family detention centers, centers that are holding transgender women, or detention centers in general. Also looking at conditions. So you actually have a pretty wide array of local focus, and that's what we found. Rather than trying to have us kind of find groups that are all working on one thing, it was actually, let's find folks who are generally in the same neighborhood and bring them together. So our role was to think of narrative. What's the narrative? What's the story that's happening here? Our role was to support in communications, and that speaks a little bit to the platform piece, which I'll get to, but really then thinking through of convergence. When do they come together to manifest power? And what was extremely successful was that groups really want to be able to do their work and do what they're already doing. They'll make the necessary decisions and really trust their judgment, but they want to feel connected to something bigger, and they want to have horizontal relationships with other like-minded groups. And so our job was to support in the coordination, bring them together in convergence, and that was where the direct action piece was very critical for the campaign. And so the first iteration of it was like, President Obama stopped deportations. We're in a really different place. And so I think groups are really kind of working in those three areas of detention work, taking on essentially ICE and DHS through individual campaigns or group campaigns, and then local policies that are either pro or, fighting bad legislation. Like right now, we're in a critical point in Arizona. A bill is about to get on the governor's desk that will institute essentially mandatory maximums for undocumented people. So more and more where we're moving to is a little bit of, dexterity in terms of the issues that groups are working on under immigration enforcement, but we're taking much of a more, rather than just trying to seek expanding relief for more people, it's actually trying to mess with the lines, the dividing lines. So really trying to find the intersections with criminal justice and immigration enforcement, and how do we dismantle some of these policies and infrastructures that are catalyzing this crisis. And then quickly, the platform question. It's a combination of tools like infrastructure that is useful for organizations, so technology. It's about creating like a public square for a set of groups. It's let's say the toys. Let's just say toys is the infrastructure for groups. The square
the purpose or the issues, and then the people. So I'm honestly still thinking about this. This is all like kind of new, freshly baked stuff. So I'm thinking about it more because the Not One More campaign was very intuitive for us. We tried to write about it later. We were kind of just inventing it. So that's my quick off the top answer.
Thank
Sorry.
you. So we have only about 3 minutes left. So I definitely want you to answer Shireen's question, and then I want to come back for final thoughts.
So I wanted to say, an example is the Ford Foundation, Open Society, and the Security and Rights Collaborative put together a solidarity summit that's been over a course of a few times, bringing together racial justice groups as well as Arab, Muslim, South Asian groups together to kind of really build relationships and really have these conversations in a place where we're almost forced to have them because they take us away and put us somewhere. And for me, that's
Forced
been really
conversations.
forced conversation. No, just kidding. But really, it's been helpful because a lot of us in this work are so busy doing our own work that we sometimes need that kind of place of reflection and a place to really understand how these issues intersect. And the other shift that I've seen in some of the philanthropy, so that is something that I encourage other funders to think about how to do that and be a part of that, especially with some of the grantees that you have. The other piece that I think has been successful from the philanthropy model, and I look at some of the program officers like Eric Ward, this idea of supporting individuals, right, and supporting movement leaders, right? Oftentimes we're supporting brick and mortar and supporting infrastructure, but there are some superstar leaders in this movement that have given this resources, have given the time to lead and to analyze and to lead the constituencies that they're from. It has been transformative for those who have been given individual fellowships and given the opportunities to get space. And I'll be honest with you, I'm one of those people who has been given some time to really help. And I feel like in the time that I've flourished and the time that I've been able to travel to my communities across the country, it is because of the support of people seeing my individual contribution as a leader in a community that has so often been on the margins. And I'll say to Shireen's question, and really to tie into what Marisa was saying, this idea of platform. I'm tired of this idea of the reactive. I want to give you money because we got to defeat Trump. So that way that you do that in the 501c3 context, there's voter engagement and voter turnout and registering voters. I'm all about that. I'm going to do it. I'm doing it anyway. It's great. But I want to work on a platform. What happens after we defeat Trump and we get into a situation where it's about time to hold people accountable to the ideals and to the values and to the movements that we have been working so hard over the course of decades to bring to a particular place? So for me, understanding what it means to fund platforms and fund opportunities to engage people around the issues and the aspirational asks of the communities that we are serving, because they are no longer moved by people, they are moved by their needs and by the issues that they care about. And I think if we start thinking about that in that way, if we start thinking about what those platforms are we the same? Are we all on the same page? Meaning within even the movements that we're in, we're not. And if there's a way for us to help facilitate us being all on the same page and telling people, don't worry, we want you to build power based on the idealism, which I think people are afraid of. That's the risk. The risk is funding people who are working from a, quote, idealistic place. I'm happy being an idealist and happy to dream and to continue to work and be proactive on building the world that I want to see versus the current world that I should be settling for, or the world that's better than nothing. You know what I mean? So I'm hoping that we can have that bigger conversation.
I think that's actually a wonderful place for us to end because we have run out of time. And I think your call to action for us to dream big and to fund from a place of vision and hope and idealism, I can't think of a better sort of takeaway from this. So I do want to encourage people to continue this conversation. There is a follow-up workshop that Heidi and Ricky and a few other people are organizing where they're going to talk much more about what funders can do and examples of funding at the intersections. And please just join me in thanking our amazing panelists.